decision would be justified by God's grace by our faithfulness. That's all we want. It's not success, whatever that may mean, but that we would hear from God and do what we hear, and that's it. And at the end of the day, I think that's what God asks of all of us in our ministry. It's a good day to start off our new series. Our series for this year is sharing the gospel with our neighbors, our friends, our co-workers. And we want to start off that series by looking at what is the gospel. And so before we even try to share it, we want to try to understand it. The gospel is simple enough that you could preach it to VBS, and I've done that. In 5 minutes, I've explained the gospel for VBS. But it's also so deep and complicated that it can take years to talk about. And so we want to spend the next 7 weeks, me being Elder Core and we will be spending the next 7 weeks sharing about the gospel, and we have chosen the book of Romans to do so. Because the Romans is all about the gospel. And that's why the book of Romans is often considered the most important book in the Bible for church history. You have heard the story of Martin Luther, who as a lawyer is in fear of the wrath of God, and then one day he's studying Romans deeply. He understands that crucial phrase, the righteousness of God, is not about divine retribution. That he's out there looking at every little minor sin so that he can punish you, and he has to because he's an impartial judge. But rather, the righteousness of God is a gift given to us to declare us right before God, that nothing stands in our way as we seek to walk with him. And that changes entire spiritual life. And in fact, it changed the church out in the West because that was the beginning of the Reformation. And there's stories like that with Augustine. There's stories like that with John Wesley. And then there are churches who have spent lots of time preaching through Romans because it's so crucial. John Piper spent 8 years, 225 sermons. We will not be doing that. Martin Lloyd-Jones spent 14 years preaching through Romans. My favorite is Michael Foster, who spent 47 years preaching through Romans. 47 years in one series. If you ask his congregation members, what was your best part, what was your favorite part, some would say the 3 years he spent in Romans chapter 3. Others point to the 10 years he spent in Romans chapter 9. Reporter went up to him and asked him, why'd you spend so much time in Romans? And his response was, look, there's a lot to unpack there in Romans. But you can't take too long or you start to lose people's interest. Most churchgoers can only hang in there for 4 or 5 decades before they start to check out. You know, we're living in different times. I was laughing when I read this. I was in Starbucks, and I was laughing out loud because Elder Core and I are going to do it in 7 weeks, talking about the gospel. But whether we spend decades or whether we spend weeks in this book, it is the go-to place. If you want to understand what the gospel is all about, it is the go-to place. Because if you see in the very beginning, right, Paul's laying it out. I'm an apostle. I'm set apart. God has anointed me to be all about the gospel, to preach it to the Gentiles. And then a little later, verse 9, God is my witness, my only calling in life. If you want to ask me, what is your purpose? What is your meaning in life? You can say it with one word, the gospel. And Paul wanted to visit the church in Rome, but he never had the opportunity. And so what he did was he took everything that he wanted to tell them about the gospel that he could not do in person, and he put it in a letter, and he sent it to them. And we get to study the gospel by reading his letter. But it's not just to explain the gospel that he sent this letter, but he wants to do a missionary trip out into Spain. And in order to do that, he needs a home base, and Rome is perfectly positioned to be the sending church. And so he wants to send this letter to explain the gospel so that in understanding the beauty of the gospel, they may be motivated to be participants in its advancement. Just like in Philippians, the more you understand the gospel, the more you will be motivated to share. See, I can't think of a better way to encourage you and to encourage myself to share the gospel with your neighbors than to understand it deeply. Because the more you see its beauty, the more your heart is not large enough to contain it, and it has to overflow. You know, my sister, she's a character. She really is. And we're very different. And she went to this one restaurant that's a Michelin-starred pizzeria. And she just loved the food. And she came over one day, and she's sharing about it. And she's so excited, almost evangelical fervor. And she talks about the sauce and the cheese and how thin and juicy it was. And she says, I got to take you. I got to take you. And she took my family on my birthday. And she sat there watching me eat. Because the more I enjoyed it, the more she enjoyed it. See, this is the gospel. There's a beauty within it where when we share it and when we bring others to it and when they see it for the first time, when the Spirit of God opens their eyes and they see its beauty, what they find is that they begin to enjoy it, and we enjoy it even more because they enjoy God through the gospel. And this is why Paul has written this letter. Because he wants the church in Rome to understand it, to see it deeply, to see how it takes all of the Old Testament stories and bring it together and combine it together into one message, the gospel, so that they would be motivated to send them on this missionary trip. And that's my prayer. And this is Elder Core's prayer. That in the next 7 weeks, that God would open your eyes and open my eyes. And more than that, to open our hearts. So that we realize that we cannot keep this gift to ourselves. You know what Peter says? He says, the angels long to look at what God is doing in the gospel. That's how beautiful it is. And so this morning, this sermon, we're just going to look at one passage, verse 16, and the first phrase, for I am not ashamed of the gospel. I am not ashamed